George woke up early in the morning as the first rays of the summer sun were beginning to pour over the neighborhood. He lived on a farm with his father and younger brother. George's mother had been missing for a year. The young man had just turned 14, so he began to help his father with more and more household chores. He quietly went out into the hallway and ensured his father was already awake. Then George ran down the stairs to the first floor. Running into the kitchen, the boy stopped for a moment and stared out the window, out of which he could see his father's rye field. The rye was already ripe, which meant that soon his father would be baking bread and taking the crops to sell. But it was the withered black bush that was sticking out in the middle of the rye field that caught his eye. The boy had always been troubled by those dead, skinny branches that seemed to reach for the sky from underground confinement, and it was unclear why his father didn't clean it up. George shook his head, driving away the gray thoughts, and ran out of the house. His father met him at the tall red barn. "The workmen are coming today to harvest the rye. I'll bake bread tomorrow," his father told George, lifting the boy into his arms. But the son was only half joyed. His mother was the only one who used to bake, and the bread always came out crisp, fragrant, and delicious. When his mother disappeared, everything in the family went wrong. The farm began to produce much fewer crops, and the cattle almost all died out. And in the middle of the rye field, this dead, black, dry, and bony bush burst out of the darkness. George loved his little brother Thomas very much. His brother had taken his mother's disappearance seriously, and now he hardly spoke. George ran all over the farm into rooms, but his brother was nowhere to be found. He found him in the rye by that dead bush. Thomas was sitting on the ground, staring at the black branches. He didn't move or look away. George was embarrassed and tense by his brother's behavior. "Let's get out of here, Thomas," the young man said affectionately, taking his brother by the shoulder. But he jerked his hand away capriciously, looking at George frowning resentfully. It wasn't the first time the young man had caught his brother in this place. Then he grabbed his brother and wanted to drag him away by force. But he screamed and started crying and kicking, and Tom bit his brother's hands and scratched and kicked him. My father came running in at the screams. He took Tom away and looked sternly at his eldest son, telling him, "Stop hurting your little brother and go to the neighbors for butter." The father carried the weeping Tom into the house, leaving George alone with the dead bush. The young man looked wary and tense at those dry, dead branches, which, like bony arms, sought to tear out and strangle George's entire family. Suddenly, the wind blew, the rye rustled in waves, and the young man shuddered involuntarily at the chill of the morning. The dry branches of the shrubbery crackled nastily, a crackling sound like death moans and growls. Overcoming a slight fright, George grabbed an extension of the bush to break it in the heat of the moment, but stopped, frozen in indecision and consternation. With his palm, he felt something beating beneath the dry branch, like veins rushing blood. The young man's fingers encompassed the dead unit and shuddered with every beat of the little vein of the bush. George stood in indecision, but after a moment, there was a crunch. Like a broken bone, a black liquid substance gushed thickly from the ragged hole. It poured itself over George's face and clothes, spilled over the soil, splashed the rye, and soaked into the ground, causing it to rot and decay quickly. The bush trembled, and its surviving branches creaked, trembling. Then there was a shrill and loud scream, unstoppable and unstoppable. Frightened half to death, George ran, sobbing, stumbling and falling, the terrible scream ringing in his ears. The black liquid got into his mouth, and he tasted a nasty taste of iron with a tang of rot. His father was on the other side of the field with the arrived workers. When he met George at first, he did not understand the matter, for George was saying unknowable things about black water, screaming, and bush. After calming his son down, his father asked him to retell the story. After listening to his son, he examined George and found no black spots or other marks on him that could confirm what George had said. The father frowned and ordered the boy to stop making stories and get to business. The offended George ran home in tears, trying not to turn around and look at the rye field. The boy locked himself in his room and sobbed with resentment and fear. But suddenly, he remembered little Tom, and wiping away his tears, he went to check on him. But his little brother was not in his room. George immediately guessed where Thomas was. Goosebumps ran down his body. George remembered the piercing scream and the taste of rot in his mouth. He fell to the floor and wept. But the worry for his brother was more substantial. George mustered his resolve, wiped away his tears, and nimbly ran out of the room, down the stairs, and into the tool shed where his father kept his tools. Armed with a steel, sharp axe in hand, George ran toward the dead bush to save Tom's baby brother. He was overwhelmed with determination. The axe was heavy, but that didn't stop George. Tom stood near the myrtle shrub and gently tied the broken branch back with some rags. There was no trace of the black liquid, as if the ground had absorbed it completely and recovered. George watched his brother from the tall grass. He didn't even notice him and hummed something to himself. Suddenly, Tom hugged a branch of the bush and kissed it. Then, the other departments hissed and reached for the boy with bony hands. The branches rattled nastily as if whispering something to Tom, wrapping themselves around his arms, legs, and neck. The boy laughed back. George saw everything from his hiding place. Terror enveloped him, but he could not restrain himself. George jumped out of his ambush with a scream and tried to hit the bush on the branch that was reaching for his brother's neck. But George missed. The branches fell behind Tom and returned to their original position. Tom was frightened when he saw the axe in his hands of intent. He flinched and squealed at his brother. He blocked the dry bush with himself, spreading his arms out to the side, shaking and glaring at George. The older brother stopped, and his hand with the axe twitched. He saw how much little Thomas cherished that dead bush, how he guarded and protected it. Thomas's attachment and tenderness to those dry branches made George wonder. He tossed the axe aside, then walked over and hugged Tom. Then George decided to himself that his imagination was running wild. When his younger brother calmed down, George invited him to play with him elsewhere, to which Tom agreed, though reluctantly at first. The axe was left lying in the rye. The brothers lost the whole day. George began to move away a little from what was happening, but Tom still behaved very strangely. He was almost silent, thinking about something for a long time, and he kept wanting to go somewhere. In the evening at supper, his father told his sons about how he and the workers had been harvesting the rye, that tomorrow he would bake bread and take part of the harvest to town. George kept wanting to ask his father about that awful bush, but he dared not for fear of upsetting Tom, who sat beside him and looked anxiously at his father. When night fell, George could not sleep for a long time. He could not forget the incident that happened during the day. Again, he felt a little frightened and uncomfortable. Suddenly, he was worried about his little brother Tom, so he decided to check on him. Carefully and silently leaving his room, George quietly opened the door of his little brother's room. Thomas was sleeping peacefully in his room, sound asleep. George exhaled with relief and went to sleep. He fell asleep quickly this time, and the shocking moments almost let him go. George slept through the night and all morning. He awoke when it was already noon. The pleasant smell of baked goods reached his room. The first thing he did was check on his brother, who was playing in his room. George's heart felt even better, and he went to the kitchen and said good morning to his father. He responded with a dry greeting and sternly reminded his son that he should have gone for butter the day before. George remembered his unfulfilled assignment guiltily and promised his father that he would bring the butter as soon as possible. George returned in the evening. There were no lights on in the house. This alarmed the boy, and he slowly began to approach the door. Quietly entering the room, he called for his father, but his father did not answer. The room was bathed in the evening light. It was beginning to get dark, and the silhouettes of things were becoming uncomfortable and unfamiliar. George tiptoed to the kitchen and whispered for his father. In response, he heard the barely audible squeaking of rope. George's heart raced. Panic gripped him, and he froze in place, clutching the maul basket. He stood for a few minutes, and when darkness had already engulfed the whole house, he peered into the kitchen. The blue, disfigured grimace of hopelessness and death on his father's face appeared before George. He dangled from the ceiling, tongue out, swaying north and east. George dropped the basket and trembled. He was feverish, panting, and tears streaming down his cheeks. Frantically, he ran outside, calling for help, screaming with all his might, but no one responded. Suddenly, he heard a child's cry that pierced through him, for he immediately distinguished the voice of his younger brother. He ran towards the scream and immediately realized where he had to go. By the time he got there, it was too late. A bald, dry bush stood lonely and commanding in the empty field. Unable to stand it, George screamed a terrible scream and began to beat himself in the face and tear his hair out. He quickly grabbed an axe and began stabbing at the dead bush from which black blood oozed, flooding George. George ran to get a shovel because the bush roots were deep underground. When he returned, He jammed the shovel into the ground with all his strength, madness, and rage, then picked up the blood-black earth and tossed it away. The stench hit him in the nose, but he kept digging and digging. Suddenly, the shovel jabbed into a solid object. A distraught George began to dig out the thing and was horrified half to death when he unearthed his mother's head. She had rotted away almost completely. He held the head in his hands, which reeked horribly, making him incredibly nauseous. The whole flesh was still being devoured by fat and ugly worms. But suddenly, his father woke George up and looked sternly at his son. He had fallen asleep under a blooming rosebush that reeked fragrance and purity.